Hi, and welcome to Inflection Points. I'm Carla Guzzetti.
And I'm Tim Harrison.
And we work for the Office of the CTO at Extreme Networks. Now, Tim, I am super excited about today's podcast. I don't know about you.
This is going to be a really interesting conversation. We are going to be talking about the drivers for change within the infinite enterprise. So that's a huge, huge topic. And it starts really with the discussion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So having the fundamental need for safety and security, and even down to the base needs of food and water. So when we have a global pandemic like we have now, which is unprecedented, those fundamental needs are impacted with global supply chains, with the ability to pay our bills. So starting there and then trying to figure out how the infinite enterprise impacts that is a really huge topic.
Yeah. And just to remind everyone, I totally agree that the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the fact that our safety is being threatened right now, it's driving what we are calling the infinite enterprise. And to remind everyone, we believe that the infinite enterprise is, or it not necessarily that we believe, but a theory we're exploring is that as the network becomes decentralized, so will portions of society and how we engage with different experiences, and will allow for more infinite connections and more infinite opportunities. Today, though, as we move towards this potential new future, how we innovate and the questions we have to ask ourselves are really important, because now that we are innovating, not because we can, which is what we've basically been doing, right? Technology has been innovating to make life easier, to add more bells and whistles, not innovating because it has to. So that context shift means that we have to ask ourselves different questions. And, we've pulled two people today to come and talk to us because these two guys get more questions at Extreme than probably anybody else.
Yeah, agreed. First off, we have Markus Nispel, who is the day-to-day leader, the innovation leader in the office of the CTO. He is the one that I go to on a daily basis. He is the one in charge of answering the questions, and he has been in solution architecture and engineering and cloud technology within Extreme for the last 8 years.
Yeah. And then the other person that we have joining us is Verboeket, who I am so excited because he is our Senior Director of Systems Engineering International. And Roy has been effectively overseeing SEs for us and system engineering for the last 9 years. He came over during Aerohive acquisition last year. He did a fantastic job at Aerohive. And then prior to that, he was with Nextel T-Mobile. So he has tons of experience interfacing directly with consumers who are asking him completely different questions now because of our pandemic situation, our new normal, and he's trying to evolve as they're evolving their own needs. So I'm really excited to talk to both of them. And let's jump into it and see what they have to say.
Absolutely. Let's get stuck in.
Thank you very much, Roy and Markus, for taking the time to speak with us today. As you know, we're here to talk about motivations and how motivations change with the infinite enterprise and the change that we're going to be experiencing in a post-pandemic world. And, we're operating under the premise that we are on the road to the infinite enterprise, which obviously changes technology and society's response to our base need of safety, which is really being threatened now. So how has that changed the conversation with your teams, Markus, when you're looking at innovation? And for Roy, how has that changed the conversation with our customers?
I would say society changes first and technology has to follow, which is, I think, a unique situation that we haven't seen before in the recent years. As we looked at innovation, we innovated because it was technically possible. Now the society, I think, is ahead of us, and we need to catch up in terms of the technology that we use to satisfy those needs that have been always there. If you look at the Maslow hierarchy of needs, but basically everybody looked at it as a baseline that we didn't have to care about, but now the pandemic has certainly changed that perspective. So first and foremost, we need to look at this differently from now on. And I think it starts with making sure that from an experience perspective, we can deliver an experience to those individuals, whether it's employees, partners, or business partners, customers from an enterprise point of view, that is not only consistent, simple, and intuitive, but is also an experience that is instant, frictionless, and allows those individuals, whether again those are employees of yours or customers or partners, to feel that they are part of something. And that mindset is definitely changing the way on how we're going to innovate moving forward. And the team is laser focused on that factor.
And from a client perspective, to chip in there, the changes that we see in the conversations, the conversation itself doesn't change. The customers they want to have a solution. They want to get somewhere. I mean, they ask us questions and they ask for solutions for a certain reason. But I think what changed the conversation is in the pre-sales discovery process, if you will. The order of the questions being asked are changing. Where in the old days, the conversations usually started with how scalable are you? How fast can we go using your equipment? All these little nitty bitty features that we offer on a network, from a network perspective, were all thrown on a big pile, and customers were pretty much interrogating you about your capabilities. And what we see now, what we've noticed over the last, let's call it 12 months ish, something like that, because the pandemic started early last year. We see customers asking more questions about when we have this conversation, how do we enable for example, our IT department to support our employees? How can we drive for consistency when it shouldn't really matter whether or not someone is working from home or from the office? We want to give them that same level of consistency. How do we respect employees' privacy? How do we secure? So it's not to say that the speeds and feeds now are all of a sudden an afterthought, but the order of the conversation is changing. We notice that customers are asking questions more along the lines of, like I just mentioned, supporting the employees. How can the IT department still be effective without having people coming into the office to fix a problem on the network side? How do we provide secure connectivity? How do we respect in Europe, for example, we have this legislation called GDPR. How do we make sure that we comply with those rules? So I think at the end of the day, the conversation itself has all the elements it had before, but the order of asking the questions and answering the questions has changed a little bit.
Right. Just following up on that, do you feel that customers know the new questions to ask? Are they questions that may have been there before but weren't in the focus or in the fore? Or are they still struggling to find the right questions because of the shift in the way society has moved? Is there still some lack of comfort about what they really need going forward?
Yeah, to a certain extent, there is, yeah. Just as an example, take, for example, the education space where, before the pandemic, you had 5, 10, 15, 20,000 students in the school, in the network. And what has happened over the past couple of months with all these lockdowns going on across the world, where all of a sudden homeschooling becomes the new de facto standard. So given that a lot of applications are running in the cloud, where you can expect your vendor of choice, whether that is your conferencing system that you use, or it's a file sharing system, or whatever program may be out there, you can kind of expect that these guys have a scalable infrastructure. But we still have a lot of schools, especially in my neck of the woods, in international markets. We deal with a lot of different cultures and countries, and there's a different way of working in pretty much every country, where some schools still have a lot of on-premises equipment running that facilitates students in being taught, like whatever, history or English or whatever they want to teach at that point in time. It requires on-prem resources. Now, all of a sudden, imagine those 5,000 students in the school with a perfectly scaled network, with a perfectly working Wi-Fi system. They've got this under control. Now those 5,000 students are all of a sudden sitting at home. Now the bottleneck is not the network. Now the bottleneck becomes the internet pipe going into the school. So we do see a lot of our customers, whether that's education or enterprise or retail or healthcare, that doesn't really matter. We do see them. I wouldn't call it struggle, Tim, but I would call it kind of like they're still discovering what they need and how do we deal with that as an organization. And I think the bigger organizations have dealt with this not because of a pandemic, but I think they have a different approach to this than the smaller ones. So it kind of depends on who you are and in what vertical you're in. That kind of changes the dynamics a little bit. But overall, the questions are to your point, to answer your original question, yes, there are different types of questions, and people are still trying to figure out if this question that they're asking, is this really relevant? Is there another way of doing it? Do we need to maybe change our behavior? Is it maybe that we need to change the way that our employees come to work, or how our students access certain applications? Or is it just something that we need to just accept that is what we need to do, and therefore we need to be able to support that from an IT perspective, as an example.
I think that's also a key concept that we see that drives the way on how we innovate very, very differently. What Roy just said, you need to be able to bring the experience to the individual on one hand. So everything that we are thinking about needs to scale infinitely small, micro to an individual. But on the other hand, the whole system and the architecture needs to be able to scale up quickly, because the number of individuals that you have to serve is, through those pandemic changes, is exponentially growing. And every enterprise needs to be fully aware of this, both from an internal perspective as you serve your employees, but also from a customer perspective as you go out, and suddenly you can have a much broader addressable market. So as we're looking at innovation and architecture sitting behind those, they need to be able to address those almost technical needs and architectural needs as well, accordingly.
So how does innovation from an existing perspective change as we look further out towards the user, the individual user, rather than potentially a pool of users who are in an enterprise environment or a campus? What is the change in mindset that's needed to start thinking in that way?
To me, it's all about the experience. How do you bring it down on one hand? How do you scale it? But also, as it's infinitely distributed, you have to be able to also optimize the cost as you look at whatever you deliver in terms of a service. It also needs to be optimized and bring it down to the individual. So the time of big infrastructure, big boxes is going away, because everybody has to have access to it. So on a per user base, you need to control that cost on one hand. On the other hand, you have to control the cost on the central side, on the cloud side, on how you scale it up. So that's definitely another paradigm that you have to keep in mind as you design and architect solutions, both internally, but also externally. And the other component to that, we always talk about, okay, it's down to the individual. True, it needs to be scalable, but what happens after the pandemic is over? Does it remain as is, or does the pendulum swing back to a degree? And depending on what market enterprises are in, they also need to rethink on how they combine that infinitely distributed experience with an experience that is more real as customers, for example, enter a brick and mortar retail store. How do you combine those experiences? How do you unify those experiences? So omni-channel as a trend in retail is there. And from my perspective, those enterprises who can combine, converge, and make those experiences the most consistent will be the ones that are most successful post-pandemic.
So I'm just going to jump in here for one quick second because Roy and Markus, you guys have just covered a large amount of ground in the last 3 questions. And I want to just take a step back and quickly summarize what we're saying here. I think, Roy, back to you, what you're talking about and the fact that we are having to redraw user experiences to various levels based on their cultural situation. We have reprioritized what people's base needs are. So safety has become the number one priority over really speeds and feeds and our ability to just innovate because we can. That has a huge impact. How, as a team, so one question that comes to mind is, how is it as a team and also as a company, do you really take a step back and redraw a user experience that has to be flexible enough and scalable enough to really address a variety of different needs around the world, really? I mean, you both are talking about around the world for individuals. So Roy, if you could give us a little bit about that. And then Markus, I do really want to come back though to what you're talking about how whether or not this change in how we think is a blip or if it's going to be permanent. But Roy, just a moment on how do you really come up with a variety of different solutions and how do you reframe questions based on a variety of user experiences?
So when you look at the technology space in general, there is, I think you could call it creativity. From where I sit, to give you a classic example is what you now see in the marketplace. It pops up pretty much on every street corner, I guess. Is the concept of contact tracing. Contact tracing itself as a pure feature I wouldn't say it didn't exist, but it wasn't as upfront and personal as it is today during these days of the pandemic. But the ability to do it, we've always had it, right? In most of the vendor landscape, there's been different parts of the technology. If you combine that, it becomes as an example, a contact tracing application. And those are the conversations that I know my team has with customers. I see that every day where a customer has a certain use case that we need to solve for. And then you see a quick collaboration between my team with each other. And it's like, I got this question from the customer, how do we fix that? And then there's like a guy from region in, let's say, for example, the United Kingdom that says, hey, what if we take this piece of information, combine it with that piece of information, which then someone in the United States says, oh, hey, if you do that, then we can do this. And ultimately that then gets picked up, for example, by Markus and his team. And it's like, hey, that sounds like a really great thing to do. Let's build on top of that. And so those are the levels of conversations happening in my team. And to your point, Carla, a lot of my guys are, they're finding new stuff every day. Customers, just when you think you've seen it all, you've had all the questions that you possibly thought were possible, something else bubbles up. And it could be contact tracing. It could be, visitor registration is another classical one. Visitor registration. Yeah, sure, it's doable. We've had that for ages, but now tie that visitor registration to location services. right? So that visitor was in my building, but where did he spend most time in the building? Which other areas in my building outside of, for example, the toilet, the cafeteria, and the actual visitor center did he potentially visit? Those are things that customers are thinking about. And then on the flip side, going back to the security and privacy element, the customer doesn't want everyone in the company to have access to that data. It's nobody needs to know that Roy was in the building and exactly where has Roy been in that building, and who has he been in contact with. You need to make sure, we need to make sure as a technology company that we give the customer the tool, number one, to get the data. Number two, the data needs to be secure. And number three, eyes only type of concept, right? So maybe you don't even want the IT manager to have access to the data, but only the CISO or maybe just the CTO of a company that needs to have access to that data, and only when applicable. So only if there's someone, that's a situation been identified as a risky situation, only then we access the data. So you need to be able to have different conversations on different levels with different people inside organizations, as well as on our partner community, as well as on our customer community. But that's just an example, Carla, about how things change and have changed over the last, let's say, 12 months.
So it sounds like what we're dealing with is a really fluid situation. It also sounds like customer needs and engineering and design and product management really have to come closer together than ever before to be able to innovate. And I can imagine that you're finding new ways of operating together and innovating together. And Markus, I just want to follow up on the question I asked you before. Because, we feel like the pandemic, we're probably likely going to be in some situation around with the pandemic until the end of 2021, possibly for the rest of the world until the end of 2022. Those are the best guesses. Are you imagining that this is going to permanently change how you innovate, or do you think this is a blip? Do you think that we're gonna have a V recovery and we will go back to prioritizing and innovating because we can and not necessarily for safety?
Yeah, I personally think it's a sustainable change in the society itself, and so also in the way on how we innovate. And a couple of drivers that I see that this is going to be a sustained change is just based on the society and the need for safety and security from each individual on one hand. On the other hand, I also think that enterprises started to see the benefits from those kind of work scenarios. Just looking at us internally. So what did the pandemic make happen? For my team specifically, we were highly distributed already, but for other teams, that I would almost call it imbalance of clustered headquarter teams versus distributed team members made it really hard for those members in the past to actively engage and be part of a team. Yeah? Now everybody is equal. Everybody's window size in a video conference is exactly the same size. So everybody is heard much more effectively, which helps a lot in terms of driving a diversity of opinions in teams, which we all know is very healthy for innovation and makes a company more overall just more successful, a team more successful and more efficient just overall. That by itself, that benefit, I don't think that most enterprises who have experienced that want to lose it. So that's going to remain that case, whether that's 7 by 24 or whether there's a mixture. Obviously, everything has its pros and cons, but definitely that's a fact. And also for us as an organization, the efficiency that we are seeing in terms of how we interact with our customers has gone up during the pandemic as well. So I'm going to expect that other enterprises have seen that as well and don't want to revert to the old mode of doing things. So those are lasting changes that are going to impact not only society, but also the way on how enterprises think about their organization, which then in turn means we have to address those needs that are coming out of those new setups consistently, also moving forward. So there's no doubt about it that this is a sustained change from my mind. On top of that, I also expect that, and we all know it won't be the last pandemic. So there's probably another one coming at one point in time. So why would everything bounce back to then bounce back again? So we would be in a swing state for a long, long time. So I don't expect that either. And the other view is in my mind, while the older ones amongst us, for us, that pandemic is 1 year out of a long lifetime. So we might consider it being a blip and it's going away. The younger ones amongst us are much more impacted. For them, it's a very different experience in terms of how the pandemic has changed their life. And those young adults or the entire generation that is growing up right now will be in employment, working for businesses in the not too distant future. So they are used to that kind of work environment, those kind of behaviors. And as they come into the business life, they are going to have a lasting impact on the market itself and how enterprises need to look at this. And that is also true for talent acquisition as well. So as you look at the expectations of that generation moving forward, and even today's adults, the new balance between being in the office and being at home, that is something that I don't think most people want to give up. So ultimately also enterprises are going to change their talent acquisition strategies along with it, which is again a lasting impact on how employees and talent is acquired, but also needs to be retained, which is the bigger challenge here as well. So how do you create an experience, a feeling that your employees are part of something big while they are all distributed and probably never met each other? Huh?
Roy, it looked like you wanted to get in on that. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, so I think a really short comment, if I may. The other reason why I personally agree with Markus about the fact that this is not just a blip. I mean, part of this will remain just because people are getting used to it, and I think a lot of businesses. If I look where I come from, the Netherlands. If you look in the Netherlands right now, you see a lot of businesses that have changed their plans for building new offices and building out these huge campuses. In the area, just alone in the area of Amsterdam, as an example, there's a lot of empty buildings right now. There's a few very large companies, global companies, that have changed their method of operation, if you will. Because people are now, to Markus's point, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter if you can find a really good employee, but he lives in the southern part of France, or he lives on the African continent, or it's someone from the Midwest in the US. You don't have to be in that office. You can now have that person. Of course, there's still the whole concept of time zones, which can make it a little bit challenging. But overall, I think, to Markus's point, the talent acquisition is definitely a big one for me as well personally. Hiring people in my team no longer have to be. Of course, there still is this element where you have to be in country or in a certain region because of the personal touch or the local language. But I also have functions in my team that do not need to be specifically tied to an office, right? It would be nice if we can find them there, just from a team perspective once this pandemic is over, which leads me into my next comment for this one, Tim, is people do business with people. Unless you are going online to shop for something, that's when you do business with a machine. But in our world, in the technology world, in our traditional, business model, people want to look people, in the eyes and just get an idea of who that person is. And I mean, can you be genuine on a Teams call or a Zoom call? Yeah, I guess you can. But I don't think that after this pandemic, this will 100% stay away and stay digital. I think the personal element will come back at some point. But to what degree, I don't know. But I'm certain that most clients, customers, partners that we have, they value the personal relationship and the personal touch.
That's great. Markus, just to start to wrap up here, just from a big thoughts perspective, as Roy just mentioned, people do business with people. And as you referred to before, everybody's distributed, so teams might not have met each other in person, for example. How does that innovation for people change your view of the direction of innovation and technology? Has it been a dramatic shift for you? And do you feel that that shift is sustainable through the innovation phase, or is it even bolstering the innovation phase that we go through?
Is it bolstering the innovation phase? So ultimately, that change, just getting back for a second to Roy's comment around people are making or doing business with people. I also agree with that, but I think also in terms of how we innovate, we can make subsequent relationships and collaboration easier between those. And that's probably something that leads to that mix of engagement models where personal engagements also for innovation are really important. If you look at what our team is doing, having an online session and collaborate on a virtual whiteboard is not exactly the same as everybody being in the same room. So there's certainly a deficiency there that in the long term can be addressed if you are able to find that mix of personal engagement and remote engagement. So long story short, in terms of customer engagement, it's obviously good if you start personally, but you can maintain a relationship long-term remotely. And in terms of innovation and being creative as a team, I would look at it almost similarly, that a certain level of personal engagement amongst the team is good, specifically at the beginning when a team is formed, but you can maintain and even expand the relationship and the energy and the ability to innovate long-term in a remote distributed environment once you have established that baseline. So hence, I think, as always in life, you need to find the right balance. And those enterprises, both from a customer engagement perspective, but also from an innovation perspective, who find that balance the quickest, will be the most successful ones.
So not only are we learning as we go along, but we're learning along with everybody else and trying to innovate to solve those problems at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both very, very much. We've learned quite a bit from you both over the last 20 minutes or so. Thank you for taking the time. I think there's a lot for us to consider, and it sounds like what we're saying is that our motivations and how we innovate and what we innovate around are going to be changing. So thank you both. Well, Tim, it was really, really interesting. I think what I found most interesting about it is that this pandemic feels like it has brought ironically, even though we're further apart, it's bringing us emotionally closer. I heard Roy say that, it's a more personal conversation with the customers, and with Markus, when he was talking about, even though everybody's more distributed, they're on an even playing field now because everybody's working remotely. And that was kind of an interesting takeaway, because that fundamentally changes innovation if you're working more closely together.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of the questions sort of flipping from speeds and feeds, as it were. So, what are your features? How fast is your device? To how is your solution going to support my fundamental privacy and safety and my users' needs? It's not that those questions haven't been asked before. It's just that they usually weren't the first ones to be asked. It was always about, tell me about your features, tell me about what you have, versus, going into the need of the user who is abstracted or distant from the speeds and feeds conversation.
Yeah. And also what I found really interesting, outside of the fact that the questions have not only changed and they've become more personal, and the order of importance has been changed. And you could imagine that the intensity of those conversations, particularly for Roy, have probably very much changed, because it's now protecting the safety of, individual employees for companies. So there is so much more emphasis on this than there was before. But I like the idea that every good business tries to pull in their customers and pull in their clients and understand how to solve for their clients. But really, right now, we have to work together and innovate together in a completely different way. We have to be much closer. There has to be less daylight between the customer and our teams, because we're both facing the same tough challenges, and it's got to be a constant back and forth. And that push-pull becomes a lot shorter in nature in order to develop together.
Yeah, as the infinite enterprise brings those hyper-individual experiences to not only us as a company trying to build solutions for customers, but the customers themselves trying to consume those things, we're in the same experience. We're having those same experiences together. We're asking the same questions, but we have to actually find a way to solve that on behalf of our customers. So when Markus talks about, flattening the team, making everybody equal because everybody is distributed, the idea that the window is the same size for everyone. Well, it's the same size in enterprise. It's the same size in medical. It's the same size in education, as Roy pointed out. I think that that's a really interesting perspective of us all being somewhat greatly leveled in how we interact with one another. And that's significant because we can't look at ourselves as separate from this experience. We are part of it. Our customers are part of it. And we have to think through it together.
Yeah. And I think to build on that, it's also interesting what Markus said when I asked him whether or not if he thinks it's going to be a blip or if this is a permanent change. And I know our assertion is, we're in a new normal. We're evolving in a new normal right now. But I think you made a really good point that this is a major driver for sustained change. And now we're going to forever reprioritize those questions that we ask ourselves because we feel the presence or the opportunity for a pandemic or another event like this. So now that we've enabled technology to do this, the likelihood of us going back is pretty slim to none.
Yeah, I would agree. Our customers have shifted. We're shifted. As this continues on, we get used to those experiences and asking those questions, and we get used to focusing on the individual rather than on the technology. So we're close. We're centering around the idea of the infinite enterprise from not only a customer perspective, but from our own perspective. I think that innovation culture is going to be key as we go forward to have that sort of diverse input, and the input being from our users, our customers, the end user, and us as an end user trying to understand how to take all this together and innovate with it. So it's a challenge going forward. It's a challenge that the Office of the CTO has certainly taken on wholeheartedly. And I think that this brings more credence to the individual being so much more important in the infinite enterprise and going forward from today.
Yeah, and I think also it's encouraging because while it's new and we're evolving and we're figuring it out, again, it's really encouraging because it seems like it's going to yield for more diversity, more opportunity for more conversation, and also it means that fundamentally, we're caring for each other more because safety is at the base of it, right? Because we all want to be able to get through this together.
And that's something that we really need right now. We need to spend more time caring about one another. And when we do our work on a daily basis, we need to keep that in mind, that everything we do impacts other people. And we want to make sure that everybody has those needs taken care of.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, that is the end of our podcast. We've learned so much. We've reframed how we're going to innovate, and I'm really excited to move on to what we're going to be talking about next.
Join us on the next episode of Inflection Points, where we discuss untangling the technologies which will enable the infinite enterprise. We'll be speaking with Jiwan Patil, Anu Gade, and Bill Lundgren, three of the key people who are responsible for delivering on Extreme's vision.